should I start this? Happy Friday, everybody. Welcome back to our channel. Today we're gonna talk about the basics: shutter speed, aperture, ISO. What do they all mean? How do they relate? And how do they change your image? Let's go. The thing that Becky and I are firm believers in is that if you understand your gear, how your camera works, and all the settings, it will make you a better photographer or filmmaker. So before we get into this, a lot of people don't really understand these concepts and they never really graduate past the green square auto mode on their camera. The reason why we like manual mode is because we have 100% control of all three settings: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. I don't want anything drifting without me knowing. This is especially important with video because if you have an exposure shift mid-shot, that looks very amateur. Additionally, shooting in manual mode will let you see the changes to the image in real time as you're shooting, and it's great for learning. The thing that unites all of those things is exposure. So how do we gauge exposure? Every camera has a light meter. It looks like this. The light meter measures how much light is coming into your camera and in turn if you're gonna have a proper exposure or not. So if the indicator on your light meter is in the center, generally it means that you're gonna have a properly exposed image. If it goes over into the minuses, that means you're underexposed, and if you go into the pluses, your image is gonna be too bright or you're overexposed. Exposure in photography and filmmaking is measured in stops. So your light meter, if you're right in the middle, you're properly exposed. If you go to the +1, that means you're 1 stop overexposed. +2 means 2 stops overexposed. And most cameras measure it in 1/3 of a stop. So every click of your dial changes the exposure by 1/3 of a stop. Keep in mind that if you have a high dynamic range scene or a very complex scene with very bright areas and very dark areas, it can sometimes confuse your metering. So now back to those three main concepts we talked about: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. The one thing that unites all of those three concepts is that they all affect exposure. You can use all of them as tools to alter how bright your image is. We're gonna first talk about aperture. Inside every lens is a multi-blade iris called an aperture. You can adjust the size, how small or how big the aperture is, and in turn, how much light is let in. So the size of the aperture is measured in an F number, and the smaller your F number is, the larger the aperture and the more light is let in. If you have a really high F number, that means you have a small aperture and only a little bit of light is let in. Shutter speed is the second parameter we're going to talk about. What shutter speed is how long the image sensor inside your camera is exposed to light. So if you didn't know, your camera has a shutter, which is essentially a curtain that covers the image sensor. When it's time to take a picture, the curtain shoots away, reveals the sensor, and comes back in and closes it off from light. How long that curtain is open for is your shutter speed. So shutter speed is measured in fractions of a second. So if you see 100 on the dial of your camera, that means your shutter speed is set to 1/100th of a second. So the shutter will open for 1/100th of a second and then close. Now you can slow your shutter speed down to say 1/25th of a second, and that'll let more light in and in turn brighten your image up. Conversely, if you raise your shutter speed to say 1/400th of a second, that will let less light in and decrease the brightness of your image. So the third parameter we're going to cover is ISO, or how sensitive your camera's image sensor is to light. This is equivalent in the olden days to film speed or ASA, but since no one's really using film anymore, the equivalent is how much the signal is boosted as it comes off your sensor. I liken it to turning the volume control on a stereo. Crank it up and your image gets brighter, turn it down, your image gets darker. So these three variables give you huge amounts of control to your exposure, but you're probably wondering, how do I know which one to change when? Well, there's a bit more to the story because each of those variables will affect the image in its own unique way, and we'll get into that now. So aperture, in addition to affecting how much light comes into the camera, it also affects another thing called depth of field, or how much or how little of the image is in focus. If you wanted to take a portrait and isolate your subject from the background, you can do that by using shallow depth of field. If I have my aperture set to a low F number or a very wide aperture, in addition to letting a lot of light in, I'll also isolate my subject by making very narrow depth of field. So only my subject will be in focus and the background will be very blurry. But remember, if you open up your aperture, you let more light in, and your image will get brighter. You'll have to then compensate by making your shutter speed faster or decreasing your ISO. Say you wanted really large depth of field so everything in the image was in focus, say for a landscape. Well, you could use a smaller aperture setting, which would be a higher F number. Some people call this stopping your lens down. But remember, doing that will let less light in, and you'll have to compensate by either slowing your shutter speed down or increasing your ISO. So now we're gonna revisit shutter speed. In addition to exposure, shutter speed also controls how much motion blur there is in the image. I'm sure all of you guys have seen shots of traffic where their light streaks are going down the road, or trails of stars in the sky called star trails, or or even shots of waterfalls where the water looks very soft. Those are all effects achieved by having a slow shutter speed. So in order to get those types of shots, you need to slow your shutter speed way down. But you're gonna need a tripod because if the camera moves at all during these acquisitions, it'll ruin the image and make it blurry. Also, keep in mind that now that you're letting more light into the camera, you'll either need to decrease your ISO to darken the image, or you'll need to make your aperture smaller, remember higher f number, to let less light in. If you're not using a tripod and you're hand holding your shots, you're gonna wanna make sure you use a shutter speed that's fast enough to stop the camera motion. We talked about slow shutter speed effects, but what about fast shutter speeds? These are great for action shots where you really wanna stop the motion and have a crisp image. If you increase your shutter speed, you're decreasing the amount of light that hits your image sensor, and in turn your image will be darker. So you're gonna need to compensate by either increasing your ISO or opening up your aperture with a smaller f number. So finally we arrive back at ISO. So in addition to affecting exposure, it also affects how much noise or grain is in your image. So if you've ever seen images you take at night and they look all speckly and you can't really see any detail, that's because there's a lot of noise. So the higher the ISO, the higher amount of noise. The lower the ISO, the more clean your image is. So generally speaking, people want to use as low of an ISO as possible to get a really clean image. But remember, you're gonna have to use a lower f number or a slower shutter speed to compensate for the exposure change. So there you have it. We've covered aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. We've looked at how each parameter affects the exposure and also what unique property each brings to the picture. If you're still a little bit confused, because I know it's a lot of information, start with the creative parameter that you want to control. So for example, if you're trying to take a nice portrait with shallow depth of field, start by setting your aperture at a low f number. Then choose a shutter speed that's hand holdable, like 1/200th of a second. And finally, set your ISO so your exposure meter is in the center and you're properly exposed. So whether you're new to photography or a seasoned creator, join our Facebook group, Pixel and Lens. It's an online community dedicated to answering your questions and getting feedback. We have weekly challenges where you can practice your skills and you can play with all of these different concepts. You can also poll the group if you have any questions. So if you're trying to sign up, please answer the questions so we know you're truly interested. The link is in the description box below. So if you like the video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell so you get notified when we post new videos. I'm not ready. With a 50 milliliter lens, milliliter, with a 50 milliliter, oh my God, I'm used to millimeters. Milliliters.